Hello YouTube. In this video we're going to examine a question that arises for moral error theory. I'm assuming you know what moral error theory is. If not, you can go and check out my video on it in the meta-ethics series. But briefly, moral error theorists claim that all moral statements are false. Moral statements express propositions that purport to describe moral values, moral properties, objective prescriptions, and so on, but there are no such things. Talk of moral goodness, moral badness, rights, duties, obligations, and so on is like talk of witches or unicorns. Morality is simply an error. This is, of course, a controversial position, but for the purposes of this video, we will assume that it is correct. This then raises a question. Now what? What is the error theorist to say about her first-order moral commitments? What should she do with respect to moral discourse? The basic issue here is that the vast majority of error theorists will continue to make moral judgments. They will continue to engage in moralized thinking. They will continue to say things like slavery is wrong and you ought to give to charity, and so on. J.L. Mackie, probably the most famous proponent of the error theory, himself defended various moral claims in the very book in which he argued that all moral claims are false. So there's a bit of a puzzle here. Now, broadly speaking, there are four ways that an error theorist can deal with moral discourse. I'm taking this taxonomy from the article The Now What Problem for Moral Error Theory by Matt Lutz, or Lutz, I'm not entirely sure how to pronounce the name, L-U-T-Z. Okay, first, abolitionism, which says that moral discourse should simply be eliminated. We should stop using moral terms, stop expressing moral propositions, and stop thinking with moral concepts. Second, conservationism. Conservationists think that morality serves various useful functions. So we should continue to believe moral propositions, even though we recognise in our more critical moments that all those beliefs are false. We should compartmentalise. We should genuinely believe the moral judgments we make in everyday life, while recognising their falsehood when we step back and do meta-ethics. Third, fictionalism. Fictionalists hold that we should continue to use moral discourse, but that we should treat moral propositions as a kind of fiction. We should not believe the moral judgments we make, but merely pretend to believe them. And finally, substitutionism. On this view, we should continue using moral discourse, but stop using it to express moral propositions. Instead, we should substitute something else. We might start using moral discourse to express states of approval and disapproval, for example. Okay, so if the distinction between these positions is unclear, a quick visual guide might help. So all error theorists agree that in actual moral discourse, as it's currently used, right, moral discourse is in fact used to express moral propositions, some of which people believe are true. So abolitionists say we should simply stop using moral discourse. Conservationists say we should conserve morality as it is. We should use moral discourse to express moral propositions, and we should continue to believe some of those propositions. Fictionalists urge that we use moral discourse to express moral propositions, but they say we should merely pretend to believe those propositions. Substitutionists urge that we use moral discourse, but that we stop expressing moral propositions with it. These views will become more clear as we go through them, but that's the basic layout of the debate. Now, an important preliminary point. You might wonder, isn't there something contradictory about holding that all moral claims are false, but then asking what we ought to do? What should we do with moral discourse? We seem to be using moral language here already just in order to state the problem, or just in order to ask the question. But that's not how this question should be interpreted. When we ask what ought we to do with moral discourse, the ought claim here is non-normative, or at least so error theorists will argue. When we ask what we ought to do with moral discourse, this is simply a practical question of which is the most efficient method for achieving our desires. There are certain things that all, or at least almost all of us, desire. A stable society, self-control, social cooperation, maximising true beliefs and minimising false ones. Our question is then, which of these four options would be the best means to realising these shared goals? Error theorists are quite happy for people to make claims like, if you want X, then you ought to do Y. That's just a matter of what your desires are plus the most efficient means of realising those desires. And so that's the way to interpret the question of what ought we to do with moral discourse. So with that out of the way, let's turn to the four theories. First of all, abolitionism. The most notable proponent of this view is Richard Garner, for instance in his article Abolishing Morality. The abolitionist says that moral discourse should simply be eliminated. We should stop talking about rightness and wrongness, goodness, badness, justice, fairness, duties, virtues, obligations, and so on. All of that should go. And in a way, abolitionism is kind of the default position. In general, when you realise that some discourse presupposes falsehoods, you stop using that discourse. Compare this to talk of witchcraft. There are no witches. All beliefs about witches are false. At least all, let's say, all positive beliefs. Obviously, the belief that there are no witches, that's true. But the claim that somebody is a witch, or that witches do such and such, right? All those sorts of beliefs are false. So we should simply stop thinking of people in those terms, right? Once we obtained good evidence that there were no witches, we stopped talking about witches and stopped acting as if witches existed. Except, of course, in some special contexts, like when we're writing fictions. So, in this sense, abolitionism is the most straightforward position. But, of course, that's not all that needs to be said. Morality is false. It's an error. But it's entirely possible for falsehoods to be useful. Newtonian mechanics is false. It has been superseded by general relativity. But we still apply Newtonian mechanics to all kinds of problems. So we shouldn't simply abolish useful falsehoods. The question then is whether the utility of moralised thinking justifies its continued practice. The abolitionist says, morality is not simply false, it's actively pernicious. It has negative outcomes, given what our goals are, and we would be better off without it. So what is the case against morality? Well, the first point that Garner raises is that morality inflames disputes, inflames emotions, and thereby makes compromise difficult. Garner gives the example of debates about abortion. When we frame this debate in terms of rights, for example, the right to life or the right to choose, then it becomes impossible to compromise without violating the demands of morality. If the fetus is a person with rights, then the women seeking abortions and the doctors providing them become basically murderers. And who would want to compromise with people who murder babies? Similarly, you often see pro-choicers accuse pro-lifers of misogyny, of hating women. Again, who would want to compromise with people who just hate women? So this kind of moralising only tends to make people more trenchant in their positions. If we were more honest with ourselves about what's really going on in this debate, so what's really going on here, at least for Garner, is that some of us care more about preserving life, some of us care more about the fetus, and some of us care more about bodily autonomy. Well, in that case, we could more easily arrive at a compromise. Garner suggests that actually the sort of standard approach that you get to abortion in Western liberal democracies, where it's acceptable up to a certain point in the pregnancy, he thinks that's a reasonable compromise in a world where some people care more about preserving life and some people care more about bodily autonomy. So anyway, one problem with morality then is that it inflames disputes and makes compromise difficult. Now, Garner is surely correct that morality sometimes has this consequence. It seems to me, though, that morality can just as often be used to make discourse more civil and to help find compromises. An obvious example would be discussions of moral issues within philosophy. People who work in philosophical ethics spend more time thinking about moral concepts than anybody else, but they do it in a relatively dispassionate way, and they're concerned with justifying their claims, with seeking consistency in their beliefs, and with exploring alternatives in a fair way. Garner's description of how morality inflames disputes doesn't seem to be true of the people who spend more of their time doing morality than anybody else, which I think should perhaps lead us to be a little bit sceptical of his claim there. Okay, a second objection to morality is that moralizing produces needless confusion. It introduces unanswerable questions. If you say, for example, that the fetus has a right to life, you now have to face questions about what are rights, where do rights come from, what properties of the fetus ground its right to life, how do we deal with a situation where these rights clash with other rights, and so on. Moralized thinking ends up adding an extra layer of controversy to any dispute, which in principle will never be resolvable. And part of the reason why it will never be resolvable is, of course, because there actually are no moral facts. There are no moral facts about, what properties of the fetus ground its right to life, and so on. I mean, actually, an interesting point here is how philosophers working in ethics have, over the last few decades, moved away from, I guess what you might call higher level ethical theorizing. So they've moved away from debates about fundamental principles like the debate between utilitarianism and Kantianism, and they tend to focus more on specific practical ethical problems. I mean, it does actually look as though these foundational debates, right, the utilitarian versus the Kantian, that kind of thing, it seems like that sort of thing is just irresolvable. So, these days, when a philosopher talks about a topic like abortion, say, they'll try to show that it's permissible or impermissible from the point of view of a wide variety of normative theories, or at least, from intuitions that we all share or something like that. So yeah, I mean, I can see that there's a sense in which, we do, when we start appealing to these moral concepts, we get this layer of controversy, which is certainly very, very difficult to resolve. Okay, third problem is that moralizing tends to preserve unfair arrangements and facilitate abuse of power. Well, that's how Garner phrases it in his article, but obviously unfair arrangement and abuse of power are moral concepts, so I assume this was a bit of a slip there. I'm not sure that Garner would actually want to endorse the claim that morality is problematic for these reasons. But the important point that he's making is that there are various social arrangements, such as the way that we've set up property laws, that produce inequalities. When the laws are given a moral defence, this also constitutes a defence of the inequalities produced by them. The inequalities become necessary consequences of what we ought to do. Indeed, perhaps the inequalities become seen as good in themselves. Moralised thinking has a tendency then to preserve the status quo, even when the status quo is leading to a lot of misery. Now, the obvious response to this point, which Garner himself notes, is that the reformers and revolutionaries can and do appeal to morality to motivate reform. Indeed, pretty much every reforming movement in history, be it slavery, abolitionism, feminism, animal liberation, separation of church and state, whatever, all of these movements have been built on moralized thinking. So I mean, the worry about Garner's position here is that by extirpating moral judgments, we will have fewer resources for motivating social reform. Now, Garner's response to this is simply that moral principles can only protect the vulnerable if powerful people accept those principles. And in fact, people will tend to accept the moral principles that tell them what they want to hear. Powerful people are unlikely to accept a moral principle which tells them that they ought to give up their privilege and power. Now, I mean, that's perhaps true, but I can't help feeling that it kind of misses the point. I mean, the idea of moralized thinking in the context of social reform arguably isn't to convince the oppressors to change. It's more to motivate the reforming movement itself, and also to convert people who are currently on the fence about the issue. Yeah, I'm not sure that Garner has a convincing response to this point. Okay, final problem with morality is that it enables global war. Without morality, the thought is, it would be almost impossible to mobilise people on the national scale for purposes of war. Now, actually, although Garner mentions this argument against morality, he doesn't himself endorse it. He does say that morality tends to be called upon to justify actions of both sides on any violent conflict, whether it's global or not, but he doesn't seem to endorse the view that morality literally enables global war, which is, understandable, because it seems like a fairly... that's a fairly extraordinary claim, and I'm really not sure what the evidence for that is. Obvious responses to this. First of all, morality is also used by people who object to war. Probably the majority of anti-war activists and conscientious objectors have appealed to moral arguments. But second, and perhaps most importantly, violent conflict, it seems to me, can be created simply by two countries or two groups having incompatible interests. I don't know why you would need morality I don't know why morality would be necessary for a war to occur. Perhaps the thought is that morality tends to make conflicts worse, but even that, it's hard to see what the justification could be, because many of the worst war crimes, as far as I can tell, were not justified in a moralized way. So if you take, for instance, war rape, that's very common throughout human history. Most of the time, people didn't even bother giving a justification for it. But when they did give a justification for it, it was usually something like, well, you have to allow the troops to have some fun and let off steam. Enemy civilians are less important than your troops, so it just doesn't really matter if the troops rape them. That's a purely practical justification. It's not a moral point. Or consider human experimentation by the Japanese in World War II. That wasn't motivated by moral arguments, it was purely practical. Their attitude was that the prisoners just weren't important, the prisoners just didn't matter, and they could be used to learn about the human body and develop biological weapons that would help the war effort, so why not? I'm again not really convinced by the morality enabling war thing. Okay, so anyway, those were some of the potential problems that are caused by morality. I must say I'm not sure I find any of these arguments all that persuasive, but that's the kind of thing the abolitionist is going to say. It does seem fair enough, I guess. Sometimes morality does have pernicious consequences. Whether morality is significantly more pernicious than any other cognitive tool that sometimes has pernicious consequences, I guess is the question here, because obviously sometimes prudential reasoning has pernicious consequences as well, but that's not really an argument against prudential rationality. Okay then, let's turn to some of the problems for moral abolitionism. Well, the first concern is that there are many respects in which morality is useful, and if we abolish morality, we will lose those benefits. So what might these benefits be? Well, here are three suggestions. First of all, we might argue that morality has an important role in coordinating people's behaviour and promoting social cooperation. We live in very complex, very sophisticated social structures, and every day we will interact with perhaps hundreds of people who all have different and often incompatible goals. Morality helps to constrain people's behaviour so as to reduce the problems arising out of conflicts of interest. It encourages us to put aside our selfish goals and act with concern for others, and obviously a world where everybody helps each other is a nicer place to live for pretty much everybody. We want a stable, peaceful society in which people help each other out, and morality helps us to achieve that. That's the idea. So what would an abolitionist say about this? Well, Garner talks about this point. He grants that when we insist that certain practices are required by morality, many people will be encouraged to adhere to those practices. A social practice that is supplemented by what Garner calls the moral overlay will constrain behaviour more powerfully than the practice alone. But notice, Garner says, that we might also supplement the practice with many other non-moral devices which do not suffer from the deficiencies of morality. So Garner says, consider the practice of promise-keeping. He suggests we could promote promise-keeping, not by arguing that promise-keeping is morally required, but by, and I quote, early and extensive training in empathy, by strict surveillance and strong penalties for promise breakers, or by massive doses of advertising by celebrities. Those are just a few options among many. In general, there are countless ways to encourage particular courses of behaviour. And even once you abandon the idea of morality, all of those other ways will still be there. By analogy, consider belief in God. Religious commitments might function as a fairly powerful check on some people's behaviour. If you believe that violating God's commands will result in an eternity in hell, you will have a powerful motivation to conform to the social practices built on what people think those commands are. Most of us, however, would find that to be a very weak argument for continuing to use discourse about God. In any case, Garner says it's questionable whether morality actually does help promote cooperation. Garner has already argued that morality, in fact, inflames disputes and makes people less open to compromise. One issue here is that morality is flexible enough to justify almost anything. So everybody tends to appeal to morality to defend whatever outcomes they happen to like. So let's say somebody steals some of my food. I can argue that their action is morally wrong because it violates my property rights. But they can argue that stealing my food in some way served the greater good, maybe from a utilitarian point of view. If you're clever enough with the calculations, pretty much any action can serve the greater good from a utilitarian point of view. Both sides in any conflict of interest can and will appeal to morality, and this use of morality will probably only make them more entrenched in their positions. A second benefit of morality, and this is emphasised in particular by Richard Joyce in his article Moral Fictionalism, is that morality helps to promote self-control. It is in your long-term interest to cooperate with others, but we are often very tempted by the short-term gains of selfish behaviour. Short-term gains are tangible and immediate. Long-term gains are distant and uncertain. We may then rationalise short-term gains as being in our best interest, even if they're really not. So then we end up failing to do what's in our long-term best interest. One of the benefits of morality is that it blocks the ability to engage in this kind of rationalisation. So moral thinking helps to reinforce prudential reasoning. When I think of stealing as being morally bad, this gives me a reason which holds immediately, it holds right now and not just in the future, not to steal. It makes me less likely to fall into temptation, less likely to rationalise stealing as being in my best interests. So morality blocks the kind of calculation mechanism that might make us rationalise poor choices, because when we think of something as morally wrong, when we think of it as being forbidden by an authority from which we cannot escape, then we must not do it, no matter whether it would be good or bad. So you don't even start calculating about it. So, Joyce says, and I quote, moral beliefs function to bolster self-control against practical irrationality. A third benefit of morality is that we sometimes have conflicting intuitions about what to do. Take the abortion example again. A woman has become pregnant unexpectedly and is wondering whether or not to get an abortion. On the one hand, she may not feel ready to undergo pregnancy and raise a child. Maybe she's young and wants to travel the world or something. But then on the other hand, she cares about the fetus. She doesn't want to end a human life. So she's torn. Engaging with moral theory might help her to arrive at a decision. And a decision that she can then, feel comfortable with. Once you, if you feel torn about something, you don't know what to do, you engage with moral theory, you base a decision on what you think is morally right, then you don't have to feel guilty about it, right? You can feel comfortable with it. So morality helps you make decisions, and then it helps you feel comfortable with those decisions. Much of the work of moral philosophy, of course, involves trying to justify particular courses of action in cases where our intuitions about what to do are unclear. All of the variations on the trolley problem are classic examples of this. So those were some of the benefits. I guess the sort of, on reflection, the standard view will probably be that morality as it currently exists has both benefits and drawbacks. It's sometimes useful and sometimes harmful. And so rather than wholesale abolition, we might instead argue that we should reform morality. But of course, that's what we already do when we engage in normative theorizing. Right? When philosophers do normative ethics, they are often asking, in what respects should common sense moral thinking be altered? And an error theorist can do the same thing. If we can keep the benefits of moralizing while reducing its harms, then we would be well advised to look for alternatives to abolitionism. A second objection to moral abolitionism is that it's not clear that it's really psychologically possible. Morality is not like other theories that have been falsified. We don't postulate morality in the way that we postulate theoretical entities to explain phenomena. Eliminating morality is not going to be as easy as eliminating caloric or phlogiston or the Aristotelian celestial spheres. Moralized thinking occurs across almost all societies. It's used in a variety of different contexts, and it even seems to form a central part of people's characters. We find it almost irresistible to classify actions as good or bad, right or wrong, virtuous or vicious. And moral concepts are good candidates for concepts that are in some sense innate, grounded in our evolutionary history. So abolitionism may seem to be a very radical proposal, requiring massive changes in the way that we think and talk. And what's more, even if we did manage to purge moral concepts from our thought, there's a worry that morality would just end up being reinvented under a different name. We might end up simply using other words in some other conceptual structure to do just the same work that morality does, with just the same benefits and drawbacks. Garner himself doubts that morality really is so ingrained. That there are, after all, plenty of non-moral resources available to the abolitionist to allow the abolitionist to explain to others what they want them to do and to give reasons why. The abolitionist can still express emotions, it's just they will not be based on moral beliefs. Garner seems to expect that we can get most of the way to moral abolitionism by simply avoiding moral words like right and wrong. So some people may worry that abolitionism is just too radical for us to actually do it in practice. So anyway, that's moral abolitionism. The second option for the moral error theorist is conservationism, and this is defended by Jonas Olsson in his book on moral error theory. So let's suppose then that we disagree with the abolitionist and we think that morality can serve useful functions, and so we should retain moral discourse. Well, the next question then is what attitude to take towards this discourse, and the conservationist says we should simply continue believing moral judgments. I should believe, for example, that slavery is wrong, that slavery has the property of wrongness. Acknowledging the truth of moral error theory should not affect our first order normative practices in any way at all. We should just carry on as we did before we ever thought about error theory. We should conserve our moral beliefs. Now, this is, of course, a little bit weird. The conservationist appears to be urging that we both believe that slavery is morally wrong while also believing that nothing is morally wrong. That is what the conservationist is urging, but that's straightforwardly contradictory. How can I believe that slavery is morally wrong and believe that slavery is not morally wrong? Well, Olson's idea is that we compartmentalise. In everyday contexts, we hold various moral beliefs. We allow ourselves to forget, or at least ignore, the philosophical arguments that led us to the error theory. But then in critical contexts, we find ourselves persuaded by the error theory and we reject all those beliefs that we hold in the everyday context. So just to be clear about this, a critical context is a context that involves scrutiny and questioning of the claims asserted in some other context. In a critical context, you are operating in the most reflective and detached and undistracted way. You subject your attitudes and behaviour to scrutiny, and you challenge the presuppositions of the discourse that you use freely in everyday life. Meta-ethics is a more critical context than ethics, because in doing meta-ethics we step back from ethics and we ask ourselves, what are we doing when we make ethical assertions? And yet, when we're doing ethics, we don't question the assumptions or conclusions we make when doing meta-ethics. So practical ethics doesn't involve casting a critical eye over meta-ethics. Meta-ethics does involve casting a critical eye over ethics. So meta-ethics is the more critical context. And the fact that we are able to switch between different contexts like this is what allows us to compartmentalize. We can hold beliefs in an everyday context while rejecting them in a critical context. When we're in the seminar room thinking about morality from the detached and critical perspective, we will be genuinely convinced that all moral claims are false. But in our everyday lives, engaging with other people, we're genuinely convinced that stealing is wrong, that stealing has the property of wrongness, and that this property is categorically normative, so it provides us with an overriding reason not to steal. That's the idea. Of course, none of this changes the fact that conservationism recommends inconsistency. It recommends holding beliefs that you yourself believe to be false. And this is unsurprisingly the basis of many of the objections to conservationism. So, first objection. To say that we ought to believe both some claim and disbelieve that claim is plainly irrational. Olson appeals to compartmentalization, but it's not clear that this actually solves the problem of irrationality. Indeed, it arguably just describes the problem rather than solves it. The fact that the inconsistent beliefs are compartmentalized doesn't stop them from being inconsistent. Compartmentalization might be the psychological mechanism that allows people to hold inconsistent beliefs, but it doesn't show how it can be rational to hold inconsistent beliefs. So, I mean, however we describe it, inconsistency is a pretty serious cost of any theory. A theory that recommends that we hold inconsistent beliefs is for that reason facing a pretty serious cost. Second objection is that it is dangerous to adopt a policy of holding false beliefs in order to promote other ends. So this is what the conservationist argues that we should do, right? The conservationist argues that, well, since morality has various benefits, it has the utility, we ought to hold false moral beliefs. So the conservationist is adopting a policy of promoting false beliefs holding false beliefs in order to promote other ends. And the argument is that this is generally a bad idea. Even if you don't care for truth for its own sake, true belief is instrumentally valuable because you need to know what the facts are in order to realize your goals, whatever your goals may be. Whatever goals you actually have, knowing the facts and believing the facts, having true beliefs, will help you to realize those goals. There are many false beliefs that might seem to bring comfort or that might seem to promote stability or whatever in the short term, but we should be very skeptical of these kinds of evaluations. Truth matters, and in the long run, believing false things can cause problems. There's that lovely quote from Richard Feynman: reality must take precedence over public relations, for nature cannot be fooled. It's one thing for a person to lie in order to maintain social stability or whatever else, like when you tell a white lie in order to keep another person happy. But to adopt a policy of genuinely believing falsehoods in order to promote the ends that morality achieves, that might seem dangerous. And conservationism advises us to hold a lot of beliefs that we know to be false. So Olson's response to this point is basically to say, yes, true belief is in general of instrumental value. But Olson thinks that we shouldn't overstate this. He thinks there are plenty of cases where false beliefs are useful. Olson gives the example of certain types of cognitive biases. Many people exhibit overly positive self-evaluations, illusions of control where none really exist, unrealistic optimism about various things, such as one's life expectancy or one's chances of success in various projects. Now, while these kinds of biases can sometimes be bad, they're also associated with positive mental health, and in a way they can act as a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. Suppose that I'm overly optimistic about the chance that some business idea will make money. I assume that I will be one of the lucky ones. Well, this will provide me with the confidence to act and to pursue the idea. Now, of course, if it does work out, that's good for me, and it's also good for society as a whole to have people who take these kinds of risks. Obviously, if it doesn't work out, then that's not so good. But that's the whole point, right? It's a risk, right? But it's good to have people going out there and taking risks. Obviously, cognitive biases can cause problems, but that's only where people have them to too great an extent. In moderation, they seem to form part of a healthy psychology. It seems that the illusions of control that people have and the overly positive self-evaluations they have, they can help to promote happiness, to provide motivation to act without really causing any problems. Olson further argues that the objection underestimates the extent to which we're able to be discriminate in our cognitive policies. So it's possible to adopt a more pragmatic policy about moral discourse while holding a very strict truth-seeking policy in other contexts, like in the context of science and mathematics. We can very tenaciously seek the truth in the areas where that matters, while being more pragmatic in other areas. You don't need to promote true beliefs all the time in all contexts. You only need to promote true beliefs where it actually matters that people believe the truth. In situations where it's not so important, well, it doesn't really matter if you hold false beliefs. And moral discourse, according to Olson, is an example of an area where it's not going to cause any problems if people hold false beliefs, right? If people falsely believe that there are moral facts. A third objection to conservationism is that, like abolitionism, it may not actually be psychologically possible. I think this worry is particularly acute for the conservationist. I mean, it may be difficult to imagine the total abolition of moral discourse, but I think with enough effort we could do it in principle. But can we, even in principle, simultaneously believe that P and disbelieve that P? Well, yes, in general it is possible for people to hold inconsistent beliefs. One of the purposes of the tools of critical thinking is precisely to reveal hidden inconsistencies, but that's the point. People can hold inconsistent beliefs when they're not aware of the inconsistency because they haven't realised what their beliefs entail. What the conservationist tells us to do is to hold inconsistent beliefs that we know are inconsistent. The inconsistency in the case of moral conservationism is blatant, and it's not so obvious that we can actually hold such beliefs. I mean, it's like, how do you do that? How can you believe both that slavery is morally wrong and that there are no moral properties, so slavery is not morally wrong? Very difficult to understand how that can work. Now, Olson, of course, has appealed to this idea of compartmentalization, and he says, well, this type of thing, this kind of compartmentalization that he's talking about, is not so unusual. He gives the example of listening to a speech by a politician who you know is untrustworthy, but who is also a very skilled orator. And you might say, well, I knew she was lying, but hearing her speech and seeing the audience's reactions, I really believed what she said. So I guess the idea is we can allow ourselves to be taken in by what people say when we're being unreflective. There are situations where our critical faculties are disarmed. And that's probably a bad thing with lying politicians, but in some cases it's a good thing. You can't go through life questioning everything. Anyway, in the same way as we might be taken in by the politician's speech, the moral error theorist may encounter actions, situations that engage her emotions of anger and empathy and so on in such a way that she can't help but to believe that those actions are morally right or wrong. She can't help but see those situations as morally charged, even when on an intellectual level she is convinced that morality is an illusion. So this might be an example of how this can work, of how, believing both that certain situations are morally charged while also believing that there are no moral properties. Maybe this is how this works. The problem with this kind of move, and this is pointed out in Matt Lutzer's article, is that it's not obvious that we should describe your reaction to the politician in that case as involving both belief and disbelief in what she says. The more natural way to describe this, Lutz thinks, is that when you are taken in by the politician's rhetoric, you've been convinced, you've changed your mind. And then afterwards, when you're being more reflective, you revert back to your previous belief, and that's just you changing your mind back again. At no point do you sort of consciously hold two incompatible beliefs, like where you're like aware of both of these beliefs, even in a compartmentalized sense, right? That just doesn't happen. You change your mind. Right, well, now we turn to what is probably the most popular response to the now what problem, fictionalism. This is defended most notably by Richard Joyce, for example, in his book The Myth of Morality. Like the abolitionist, the fictionalist recommends that we should not believe any moral propositions, but she does not want to abandon moral discourse. Rather, the fictionalist recommends that while we should continue to express moral propositions, we should no longer believe them, no longer treat them as assertions about reality. Instead, we treat them as fictions. We can pretend that some moral propositions are true. We pretend that there are moral facts, moral properties, moral values. None of us believe that Sherlock Holmes lives on Baker Street, but we may still accept that Sherlock Holmes lives on Baker Street when we engage with the stories by Arthur Conan Doyle. We pretend that the stories are true. Joyce asks us to imagine a fan of the Holmes stories running around London, finding the places where Holmes's most famous activities occurred. She sees a street and she says, that's where Holmes met Moriarty. Now, she doesn't really believe this. She's playing along with the story and allowing the story to govern her language and her actions. The moral error theorist can treat morality the same way. She can play along with the story. Now, there's an important distinction between two types of fictionalism, content fictionalism and force fictionalism. According to content fictionalism, statements concerning fiction should be interpreted as being prefaced by a fiction operator. So the statement, Sherlock Holmes lives on Baker Street, really means something like, in the stories written by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, Sherlock Holmes lives on Baker Street. Now notice that on this view, fictional statements are actually true. It's true that in the stories written by Arthur Conan Doyle, Sherlock Holmes lives on Baker Street. Applying this to the moral case then, the content fictionalist would recommend interpreting a statement like slavery is wrong to mean something like, according to the fiction of morality, slavery is wrong. And if we adopt that view, then the fictional statements can be treated as true. By contrast, force fictionalism says that statements concerning fiction are not genuine assertions at all, but merely pretend assertions. When I tell the story of Sherlock Holmes, and I say that Sherlock Holmes lives on Baker Street, I'm not claiming that, according to the stories written by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, Sherlock Holmes lives on Baker Street. I'm simply pretending to assert that Sherlock Holmes lives on Baker Street. What makes something fiction, according to the force fictionalist, is not the content of the proposition. It's not that there's some tacit fiction operator attached to the beginning of the statement. Rather, it's the attitude that you have towards the proposition. When we engage with fictions, we do not believe that some proposition is true. Rather, we make believe that some propositions are true. So applying this to the moral case, the force fictionalist recommends that when we use statements like slavery is wrong, we adopt the attitude of make-believe towards the proposition that slavery is wrong. This might seem, I don't know if this is entirely clear, so hopefully this diagram will help show the difference between these two positions. For content fictionalism, there's just one type of attitude, belief. And we can have the attitude of belief towards standard propositions or fictional propositions. What makes a proposition a fictional proposition is that it is prefaced by a fiction operator, where you say something like, according to the stories by such and such, this happens, right? According to force fictionalism, there are two types of attitudes. There's belief and make-belief, or pretense, and we might have these different attitudes towards the same proposition. So there's no such thing as like a fictional proposition. Rather, fictionalizing consists in make-believing a proposition, or pretending to assert a proposition, or pretending to believe a proposition. Now, Joyce favours force fictionalism for two reasons. One problem with content fictionalism is that it cannot distinguish between telling a story and simply describing a story. When I say, according to the stories by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, Sherlock Holmes lives on Baker Street, I am describing the content of Doyle's stories. But this isn't what Doyle himself was doing, so Joyce thinks. Doyle himself was simply telling the story. He was pretending to be reporting about a realm of facts concerning the character Sherlock Holmes. He was not actually asserting anything, he was merely pretending to assert. And that seems, I think, intuitively plausible. There does seem to be a distinction between reporting the facts about a piece of fiction and then telling the fiction, or imagining that the fiction is true. When you imagine that the fiction is true, it engages your emotions in a way that mere description of the content of a fiction would not. And this idea that when telling a story we pretend to assert propositions, that's the idea of force fictionalism. A second problem for content fictionalism concerns reasoning with fictions. So consider the following argument. Gold is deadly to Cybermen, my ring is made of gold, therefore my ring is deadly to Cybermen. This is clearly a valid argument, but if we treat premise 1 and the conclusion as containing a fiction operator, where we might interpret it as something like, according to the fiction of Doctor Who, gold is deadly to Cybermen, then the argument isn't valid. It's just clearly no longer valid, right? The conclusion just doesn't follow. One way around this would be to add the fiction operator to all parts of the argument. So we'd also have, according to the fiction of Doctor Who, my ring is made of gold, right? But then that premise is just obviously false, and not only that, it would be bizarre to assert it. No story ever written by anybody in Doctor Who says anything about what my ring is made of. And when when I present this argument, it doesn't look like I'm saying that, according to the fiction of Doctor Who, my ring is made of gold. The content fictionalist struggles to account for how we reason with fictional ideas. Now, contrast this with force fictionalism. Force fictionalism does not include tacit fiction operators. For a force fictionalist, the content of the proposition doesn't change. It's just that when telling a story, you only pretend to assert the proposition. So I pretend to assert that gold is deadly to Cybermen. Somebody who genuinely believes that Cybermen exist and that gold is deadly to them asserts the same proposition that I merely pretend to assert. Now, this solves the problem of reasoning with fictions, because a valid argument remains valid even if only some of the premises are actually asserted. I mean, when a logic teacher gives you the argument, all fish are mortal, Socrates is a fish, therefore Socrates is mortal, well, she's surely not asserting that Socrates is a fish, right? She's just kind of offering it as an example. But it's still a valid argument, because the validity of the argument depends only on the propositions it contains, not on your attitude towards them. So in the case of the Cyberman argument, we can, if we wish, go along with the fiction. We can play along with it. We can combine the make-believe premise 1 with the genuine assertion in premise 2, and then on that basis we can make-believe the conclusion. So for these reasons, Joyce thinks that we should be force fictionalists about morality. We should carry on expressing moral propositions, and we should interpret those propositions in the usual way, but we should adopt the attitude of make-believe towards them. Of course, the question is, why? Well, fictionalists think that morality serves useful functions, such as streamlining social cooperation and bolstering self-control. What's more, they think that adopting a make-believe stance towards morality will constrain our behaviour in much the same way as genuine moral beliefs currently do. Fictional moralising can serve the same functions as genuine moralising. You can make a commitment to acting in accordance with what the fiction of morality demands. And this will guide your behaviour in much the same way as the Holmes enthusiast used the fiction of Sherlock Holmes to guide her language and activities on the trip to London. Now, of course, when you make a commitment to the moral fiction, that's going to be much deeper and will affect many more aspects of your life than, you know, trying to visit the same spots as Sherlock Holmes. But in principle, it's the same kind of thing. Joyce also points out that engaging with fictions can affect our emotional states. Watching a movie or reading a book may provoke fear, anger, sadness, disgust. And emotional states play a motivational role. They move us or constrain us. And so this is one way in which treating morality as a fiction can reap the same rewards as genuine moral belief. Even make-believing that stealing is wrong may prompt negative emotions towards stealing, which will help overcome any temptations to steal. So that's the idea. Now, an initial problem for fictionalism, or perhaps it's more just a question, is how exactly do we distinguish believing something from make-believing something? Here's how Joyce defines belief and make-belief. So here's what he says. Belief, in the case of belief, S believes that P only if 1. S has assented to P in her most critical contexts, and 2. S is disposed to assent to P in her most critical contexts. In the case of make-belief, S make-believes that P only if 1. S is disposed to assent to P in some contexts, 2. S has assented to not P in her most critical contexts, and 3. S is disposed to assent to not P in her most critical contexts. All right, so let's take an example of this. Suppose that in ordinary contexts, Frank uses a discourse which seems to presuppose some theory T. And suppose that in critical contexts, Frank does not endorse theory T. And in general, Frank is disposed to reject theory T when a critical perspective arises. Well, Joyce would say that Frank does not really believe T. The key idea is that critical contexts reveal your genuine beliefs, and you may inhabit such contexts only very rarely, maybe less than like 0.001% of the time. That doesn't matter, because belief is dispositional. Even if Frank explicitly rejects T less than 0.01% of the time, and he continues using it for practical purposes the rest of the time, he always has the disposition to reject T in critical contexts. So he doesn't really believe T. So that's how Joyce distinguishes belief from make-belief. The obvious concern about this way of drawing the distinction between believing and make-believing is that it renders fictionalism and conservationism equivalent. After all, Olson, the conservationist, would be happy to accept that in critical contexts you will no longer assent to the moral claims that you make in everyday contexts. That's the whole point of compartmentalization. You assent to the moral claims in everyday contexts while assenting or being disposed to assent to the view that all moral claims are false in critical contexts. So this raises the question of, is there really a distinction between fictionalism and conservationism? I mean, it seems to me that there is a distinction, but perhaps we should emphasize instead this idea that the difference between believing and make-believing is a matter of attitude. So the distinction isn't simply about whether or not you're disposed to assent to something in critical contexts. And in general, the distinction isn't just dispositional. Believing and make-believing feel different. They have a different phenomenology, in the same way as belief and desire feel different. I mean, obviously the challenge is to spell out exactly what this difference is, but I don't know if that's so hard to answer. It seems to me that we can just appeal to the distinction between belief and imagination. Make-believing is a kind of imagination. And I mean, that seems independently plausible, right? When you tell a story, one of the things you're doing is imagining the story and expecting the audience to imagine it along with you. So I think that should be enough to distinguish the fictionalist from the conservationist. Make-believing is a kind of imagining, whereas belief is not. Maybe that works. Okay, let's turn to some of the more serious difficulties for fictionalism. Now, recall that the motivation for fictionalism is that Moralized thinking has various benefits, but we don't need to actually believe moral claims in order to reap those benefits. It's enough to play along with the moral fiction. Well, as Matt Lutz points out, playing along with a story has its limits. When the Holmes enthusiast reads about Moriarty's latest plot in the new Sherlock Holmes novel, she's not going to run down to Baker Street to warn Holmes about what she's learned. Indeed, to do so would be irrational. It would evince an inability to distinguish fiction from reality. Or recall the analogy to God that I made earlier. If you genuinely believe that premarital sex is against God's will and that those people who violate God's will be sent to hell, then you'll have a strong motivation to avoid premarital sex. But let's say you cease to believe this. You come to think of it as a mere fiction, though a fiction that for one reason or another you choose to continue engaging with. It doesn't seem like this is going to provide much constraint on your actions. I mean, you no longer actually have a good reason to avoid premarital sex. And so the worry is that it's going to be the same with morality. If you see morality as a fiction, then sure, you can keep using the discourse. You can keep saying that things are right and wrong, but the consequence of the fictional attitude is that it's going to lose its ability to constrain your behaviour. Moralized thinking can only help regulate our conduct and improve self-control if we hold genuine moral beliefs. Otherwise, its motivating force evaporates. Well, Joyce says this is just too simplistic. He says there are actually uncontroversial cases where engaging with fictions can motivate people to act. And a nice example he gives of this is to imagine that, imagine I want to start exercising regularly. And I know that I prefer lounging on the sofa to doing the hard work of exercising. And I know that I often succumb to temptation, right? That even when I kind of want to exercise, I'm just not going to because it's more comfy sitting on the sofa. So in order to motivate myself, I might lay down a strong and authoritative rule, and I might say to myself, I must do 50 sit-ups a day, no less, or I will fail, right? Like, I must do, if I don't do 50 sit-ups, I'm just not going to get fit. Now, this is obviously not true. I don't need to do 50 sit-ups a day in order to get fit. It would be good enough to do more or less 50 sit-ups on most days. I could get away with skipping a day. I could get away with sometimes only doing 40 sit-ups. But the problem is that if I allow myself to lapse, if I allow myself sometimes to stray from the routine, then I'm sabotaging my willpower, and I'll probably end up failing to achieve. I'll end up failing to achieve even the more or less 50 sit-ups on most days, right? So I have to treat 50 sit-ups a day as non-negotiable. I have to think of it as something I absolutely must do in order to be fit. And yet for all this, I don't actually believe that 50 sit-ups is a non-negotiable requirement for fitness. I know perfectly well that it wouldn't matter if I strayed from the routine occasionally, but it's not advisable to pay attention to this belief when you're actually doing exercise. When you're about to do the exercise, it's better to approach it maybe as a kind of game, right, where a certain number of sit-ups simply must be achieved in order for you to succeed. And so this is an example of something that we know is false, but that does seem to play a motivational role. And I think Joyce is right about this. I think we do tell ourselves these sorts of things. We do, pretend that certain things are true in order to motivate ourselves. Now, of course, this might not capture everything that we want out of morality. For many of us, our moral convictions just seem so much more important and significant than propositions like, I must do 50 sit-ups a day to remain fit. Those are falsehoods that we might temporarily adopt for some self-interested goal, but which we can easily abandon either once the goal is achieved or if our goals change. If I decide I don't care so much about fitness, then I'm not going to need to do 50 sit-ups anymore. We think of our moral commitments as being stronger than that, as being binding regardless of what our goals are. And so maybe this is the real concern about fictionalism, that even if fictionalist morality can motivate us, it can't motivate us in the right kind of way. Maybe that's a concern. But then, this is this is error theory, right? It's not surprising that you're not going to get necessarily everything you want out of a fictionalist morality, but perhaps it can still bring some of the benefits that moral beliefs can bring. Okay, another problem for fictionalism is the disagreement problem. Consider these two fictional claims. Earth was invaded by Daleks in 2015. Earth was not invaded by Daleks in 2015. These seem to be contradictory, but actually they're not, because they're both make-believe. These both describe two different fictional scenarios. When people make these statements, they're not really asserting either one of them, they're fictionalizing, they're just make-believing them. And so the point is there's no real disagreement here. Somebody who says the first is not actually contradicting somebody who says the second. So, if we decide to interpret morality as a fiction, then it looks like it's going to be very difficult to account for moral disagreement. People do disagree about moral matters. They often have very heated disagreement about moral matters. But how can this make sense for a fictionalist? How can a make-believe commitment be incompatible with, or how can it disagree with another make-believe commitment? If you're only make-believing that slavery is wrong, why would you be concerned about people make-believing that slavery is permissible? I mean, where's even the disagreement there? That there isn't a disagreement. You're not contradicting each other. This problem is closely related to another, which we might call the internal consistency problem. So I can engage with a lot of different fictional worlds. I can imagine worlds that differ from our world in all sorts of different ways. If I'm engaging with the fiction of Doctor Who, then I might well make believe that the Earth was invaded by Daleks in 2015. On the other hand, if I'm engaging with the fiction of Peep Show, I would not make believe this. That's not part of the fiction of Peep Show. Indeed, even a single fictional world can be internally contradictory. Doctor Who, as a whole, might imply different things about whether Earth was invaded by Daleks in 2015. In fact, Doctor Who in general has never had much concern for internal consistency. So, you can quite easily find these sorts of contradictions in the fiction of Doctor Who. Anyway, the point is this. Make-believing X does not actually raise any difficulties for make-believing not X. You can do both quite easily. But this is not how moral commitments work. When I claim that slavery is wrong, this commits me to claiming that slavery is not permissible. And what's more, my commitment to the wrongness of slavery isn't something I can just give up. I can't just switch to the fiction where slavery is permissible in the way that I can switch between the fictions of Doctor Who and Peep Show. And so there's a requirement of internal consistency that fictionalism doesn't seem to preserve. Okay, a final problem for fictionalism is that, like the previous theories, it may simply not be possible. And this was pointed out by Richard Garner in his article Abolishing Morality, which I've already mentioned. The issue here is this. How can a person utter sentences that they know to be false while avoiding making any false assertions? Well, generally, we avoid asserting falsehoods when using false sentences because something in the context or something we say specifically indicates that we are no longer asserting. When I pick up a book by Arthur Conan Doyle, I know that he's not making genuine assertions because I know the conventions around fictions. Or when speaking, I might indicate that I'm fictionalizing by prefacing my statements with something like, once upon a time. That's a phrase that indicates that a fiction is about to come. Basically, there are various ways in which we can indicate that we're engaging in fiction, and this will cancel the assertoric force of our statements. It will show the audience that they should no longer treat the statements as genuine assertions. But what if you do none of these things? And the worry is this. There are many people in the world who are not fictionalists. I mean, most people are not fictionalists. Most people treat moral utterances as genuine assertions. And Perhaps they even think that there are moral facts. So when I engage in moral discourse with such people, they will take my moral utterances to be moral assertions. And it's plausible to suppose that if all my listeners take my utterance to be an assertion, after I have done nothing to indicate that I am not making a genuine assertion, and I know that as a result the listeners will interpret me as asserting, well, in fact, in that case, I'm making an assertion, regardless of my intentions. I mean, and this is a problem because the vast majority of people are not fictionalists. They don't use moral language with a fictive attitude. When a fictionalist says things like slavery is morally wrong, her listeners will generally treat her as making a genuine assertion which expresses a genuine moral belief. Now, of course, one way around this would be to say, whenever moral issues come up in a discussion, would be to say something like, well, I don't really think that anything is morally right or wrong, morally good or bad. I don't really think there are any moral properties, but I think it's useful to play along with the fiction of morality, and with that in mind, slavery is wrong. You could say things like that in principle, but of course, pretty much no fictionalist actually does this. Fictionalists will just go ahead and make moral statements, which, for all intents and purposes, are just the same as the moral statements made by everybody else. It would obviously be, it's possible for fictionalists to indicate that they are fictionalizing, but that would make their statements a lot more cumbersome, right? It would just make it a lot more difficult to engage in moral discourse. Of course, one of the problems here is that, if somebody's talking about slavery, and then you say something like, well, I don't really think that anything is morally right or wrong, that's then just going to probably lead to a debate about meta-ethics, or it's, at the very least, you're going to have to explain why you think that, and you're going to then have to explain why, even though you think that nothing is morally right or wrong, you're able to engage in moral discourse, and so you're going to have to explain why you're a fictionalist. And it just becomes very difficult, obviously, to engage in standard moral arguments and moral discourse. So Joyce's response to this is that fictionalism is proposed as a group strategy. Basically, it's what we should do once we have convinced many people of the error theory. A group can follow a convention whereby once a certain subject is brought up, they no longer treat their interlocutors as making assertions. And you don't need to do anything in particular to indicate that you're not making an assertion. The subject matter alone is enough. We already do this with many fictions. If I start talking about the war between Daleks and Time Lords, you immediately know, just from the subject matter, that I'm fictionalizing. A society of error theorists would view moralizing in the same way. Of course, this still leaves open the question of what current error theorists should do now in a society where most people are not fictionalists. In the world as it currently exists, people will treat you as making genuine assertions when you moralize. So is fictionalism possible for you? Can you be a fictionalist in this situation, or will you have to at least temporarily adopt one of the other options until error theory gets more widely accepted? Right, so now we come to the final theory, substitutionism. This is the theory defended by Matt Lutz. It's also defended by Toby Svoboda in the article Why Moral Error Theorists Should Become Revisionary Expressivists. Substitutionism says that we should continue to use moral concepts and continue to make moral judgments. Like conservationists and fictionalists, substitutionists want to preserve moral discourse, but we should stop using moral discourse to express moral propositions. We should substitute moral propositions with something else. Moral discourse should not be governed by believing or even make-believing propositions with moral content. So what should we substitute for the moral propositions? Well, Svoboda takes a leaf out of the non-cognitivists book. Recall that non-cognitivism claims that moral judgments do not express beliefs, but rather attitudes of approval and disapproval. So the claim, abortion is wrong, does not attribute the property of wrongness to abortion, but instead expresses some emotional disposition like boo to abortion, or maybe a command like do not abort, or whatever. Now, Traditional non-cognitivists are attempting to describe how moral thought and moral language actually function. Obviously, the error theorist does not agree with them on this point. Error theorists claim that, in fact, we currently use moral language to express beliefs about the world. Error theorists are cognitivists. But in dealing with the now what question, the error theorist can take non-cognitivism to provide a good model of how we ought to use moral language. We should stop using moral language to express false propositions and instead use it to express attitudes. Substitutionism can take some inspiration here from Simon Blackburn, who himself is not an error theorist, but he has a nice discussion of the consequences of error theory in his article Errors in the Phenomenology of Value. Blackburn imagines that you're an error theorist and you decide to stop expressing moral propositions on the grounds that you don't want to express falsehoods. You decide to no longer participate in moral evaluation. But then Blackburn points out, well, just because you've stopped making moral evaluations, you're not going to stop evaluating entirely. You're still going to care about what happens in the world. You're still going to approve of people who give to charity and disapprove of people who commit acts of terrorism. Okay, you don't frame this in moral terms, but you still have preferences and you will still express those preferences. Blackburn calls this activity schmoralizing. So you can't moralize anymore, but you can schmoralize. Now, the question is this: how should we communicate our schmoral judgments? How should we engage in schmoral reasoning and schmoral debate? Well, obvious option is just to commandeer moral vocabulary. Moral vocabulary already provides a very sophisticated conceptual structure that can be reapplied for the purposes of schmoralizing. So you express your disapproval of terrorism by saying that terrorism is wrong, that people ought not to commit acts of terrorism, that those who do so deserve to be punished, and so on. This is a clear statement of non-cognitivist substitutionism. Now, it's worth noting that non-cognitivist substitutionism is not the only form of substitutionism. We might instead favour a kind of relativist substitutionism, where moral beliefs are replaced with beliefs about the dominant norms of one's culture or something like that. So, on this view, abortion is wrong would mean the society in which I live disapproves of abortion. There are many options for the substitutionist. The question would just be which form of substitutionism preserves most of what we actually want to preserve of moral discourse. One obvious drawback of the relativist approach is that it would arguably render you unable to engage in moral debate. Many people want to reform the norms of their culture, like somebody who lives in a culture where abortion is outlawed and urges that abortion be legalized. For the relativist substitutionist, abortion is wrong would just report the fact that your culture disapproves of abortion. And if that's true, well, there's no further argument to be had about that. Let's assume non-cognitivist substitutionism for now, but just note that there are other forms available. Okay, well, if we think that we should substitute non-cognitive attitudes for moral propositions, the next question is, how do we actually go about making this revision? Well, Svoboda suggests that there are two things we can do. First of all, we can lessen the assoteric features of moral discourse. Where possible, instead of saying things like killing is wrong, we might outright say, boo to killing or do not kill. We might start trying to use more often sentences that wear their non-cognitivism on their sleeves. Of course, we wouldn't want to abandon standard moral statements entirely. That would be abolitionism, not substitutionism. So as on standard non-cognitivism, utterances with a cognitivist surface grammar can be used to express non-cognitive attitudes. The idea is just, where it's convenient, we should inject more blatantly and non-cognitive sentences into our moral discourse. But second, and more importantly, we should completely abandon the attribution of moral truth, moral knowledge, moral belief, and so on. We should stop saying things like, it is true that killing is wrong. We know that killing is wrong. I believe that killing is wrong. Statements like these are simply misleading, and it's fairly easy to avoid thinking in terms of moral truth and moral knowledge, so we should do that. We should openly embrace the fact that non-cognitive moral judgments do not express beliefs and are not truth apt. What are the benefits of substitutionism? Well, Svoboda suggests several. He says, first of all, the substitutionist can retain many of the benefits of moral discourse while completely avoiding moral error, unlike the conservationist. Non-cognitive judgments do not even purport to represent moral facts. They're not propositions about the world. So there's no danger of moral error here. Second, substitutionism preserves the motivational force of morality. We saw that fictionalists have trouble accounting for why anybody should care about the moral fictions. Why exactly would pretending to believe something motivate you to act in any particular way? When I pretend to believe that Daleks have come up with some new diabolical scheme, I don't run to find the Doctor to warn him. But if moral propositions are replaced with non-cognitive desire-like attitudes, there's no problem of moral motivation at all. Desire-like attitudes have a motivational force. Indeed, recall that the argument for moral motivation is one of the classic arguments for standard non-cognitivism. So there doesn't seem to be any issue with desire-like attitudes functioning so as to motivate behaviour and constrain our behaviour in various ways. Third, substitutionism easily accommodates moral disagreement by understanding it as involving disagreement in attitude. If I approve of abortion in some circumstances while you disapprove of abortion no matter what the context and would prefer that nobody ever get abortions, well, there's a clear sense in which our desires are incompatible. It's not logically possible for both desires to be satisfied. Similarly, substitutionism solves the internal consistency problem because we want our own desires to be coherent, right? We want our set of desires and our attitudes of approval and disapproval to be such that, we want our desires to be such that they can actually be realised in the world. And if you were to hold two incompatible moral views, if you were to endorse both having slaves and slavery being wrong, then that's not something that could actually be realised. So in these ways, substitutionism is supposed to be superior to fictionalism. What about the problems for substitutionism? Well, obviously that's a bit difficult to say because it's going to depend on what form of substitutionism a particular philosopher defends. But if we're substituting non-cognitive attitudes for moral propositions, well, that's going to face many of the problems of standard non-cognitivism, in particular the Frege-Geach problem. So basically the Frege-Geach problem is that moral sentences retain the same meaning even when they're embedded in more complex sentences. So remember, according to the non-cognitivist substitutionist, abortion is wrong should be used to express the attitude of disapproval to abortion. So it would mean something like boo to abortion. But for many cases where we embed the sentence abortion is wrong into a larger sentence, it can no longer plausibly be taken to express any emotion. So consider, for example, if abortion is wrong, then killing adults is wrong. I wonder whether abortion is wrong. Frank thinks that abortion is wrong, and so on. In none of these sentences is a person expressing disapproval of abortion, and nor does it make any sense to say that they ought to be expressing disapproval of abortion. Like non-cognitivists, it doesn't make sense to substitute disapproval of abortion for the moral proposition in these sentences. Because, well, let's take if abortion is wrong, then killing adults is wrong. You might well hold that abortion is perfectly fine while endorsing the conditional claim that if abortion were wrong, then killing adults would be wrong. Perhaps on the grounds that you consider adults to be of higher moral status than fetuses or something like that. With the second sentence, I wonder whether abortion is wrong, you're unsure of your moral attitudes. And obviously the third sentence, Frank thinks that abortion is wrong, that doesn't express any attitudes towards anything, but simply reports what another person's views are. So the question for the substitutionist is, what exactly should we think is being expressed by the moral sentence when it's embedded in these larger sentences? Should we insist that people just stop embedding moral sentences like this? That would render us unable to make moral arguments, and it would render us unable to, it would mean that we're no longer able to talk about morality in many of the ways that we currently do. Now, obviously, there's a lot of work on the Frege-Geach problem. The substitutionist can appeal to this work to help solve it, but obviously some explanation needs to be given here. Okay, another problem for substitutionism is that it may not actually be possible, for the same reason as fictionalism. Substitutionist moral language has the same surface form as standard moral language. There are many people in the world who are not substitutionists and who will interpret my use of moral language as expressing moral propositions, and it may be argued that if my listeners take me to be expressing a moral proposition, after I've done nothing to indicate that I'm not expressing a moral proposition, then I am expressing a moral proposition regardless of my intentions. So this may be an issue. Of course, one obvious option for the non-cognitive substitutionist at this point is to appeal to arguments for descriptive non-cognitivism and to try to show that actually people don't treat moral sentences as expressing propositions, even if the surface form, let's say, of moral sentences is propositional. But then the substitutionist will have to be careful not to end up endorsing standard descriptive non-cognitivism, right? I mean that's the danger there. The substitutionist is a cognitivist error theorist who is proposing non-cognitivism as a model for how we ought to use moral language, not how we actually use it. So we have to be a bit careful going down that road. Anyway, it's I think an interesting point that all of the major positions in the now what debate have been subject to the criticism that they are impossible to adopt for one reason or another. Abolitionism is said to be impossible because moralizing is so deeply ingrained, we just can't stop using moral discourse. Conservationism is said to be impossible because it's simply blatantly incoherent. Fictionalism and substitutionism are said to be impossible because of the way that the meanings that you express with your statements are dependent on how others interpret you, and the vast majority of people are not fictionalists or substitutionists. So that's just, like I say, an interesting point there, I think, about all of the views that are available in the debate. Yeah, that's all I wanted to talk about today. I hope you found that interesting. But that's all. Goodbye.